What's happening? I don't know what's happening!
Climb, climb!
We're losing control of the aircraft here! We lost all control of the aircraft!
Air France Flight 228, carrying passengers and crew, takes off from Rio de Janeiro Airport in Brazil, bound for Paris. The flight included people from 30 different countries. For this flight, a very advanced airplane was used, equipped with a highly reliable autopilot system. Trusting this system, the crew could comfortably manage the 12-hour journey. However, due to the long distance, an extra pilot was provided to ensure the cabin crew could get proper rest. Despite all precautions, the pilots make a critical mistake. As the plane flies straight, it suddenly tilts upward and then starts descending rapidly. The pilots make every effort to regain control, but the plane crashes into the ocean at a speed of 282 kilometers per hour. All 228 people on board tragically lost their lives on the spot. This was one of the most shocking and painful incidents involving any Air France flight. But what exactly happened inside this flight that caused the plane to plunge straight into the ocean from an altitude of 38,000 feet? And despite having 3 pilots on board, what repeated mistakes were made in operating the plane? This is what we are going to explain in today's video. Before we begin, we request you to subscribe to our channel so that we can continue bringing amazing stories like this to you. So let's start this story. On June 1st, 2009, Air France Flight 447 was preparing to depart from Rio de Janeiro Airport in Brazil, bound for Paris, the capital of France. This flight had 216 passengers, 3 air crew members, and 9 cabin crew members on board. The aircraft being used for this flight was an Airbus A330-203, which featured several advanced technologies and was one of the newest A330 planes in Air France's fleet at the time. This flight was expected to last 12 hours and 45 minutes. Instead of the usual 2 pilots, 3 pilots were assigned to this flight, following Air France's regulations that require pilots to take a break after 10 hours of duty to ensure they remain fresh and focused. The command of this flight was in the hands of 58-year-old Captain Marc Dubois, who had 10,098 flying hours of experience, including 1,700 hours of experience flying the Airbus A330. First Officer Pierre-Cedric Bonin, aged 32, was on board to assist the captain. His wife Isabelle was also a passenger on this flight. Pierre-Cedric had 2,936 hours of flight experience, including 807 hours on the Airbus A330. In the cockpit was also Relief First Officer David Robert, aged 37, with 6,547 flying hours of experience, out of which 4,479 hours were on the Airbus A330, just like his fellow pilots. The weather at departure was ideal, but there was a significant chance the plane would encounter a severe storm later during the flight. The plane had to cross the equator, passing through the Intertropical Convergence Zone, ITCZ, a climatic phenomenon where trade winds from the northern and southern hemispheres meet. This area is known for thunderstorms, heavy rainfall, and other weather challenges, making the flight path complex. Before departure, the pilots discussed the potential challenges, including the storm, and began the pre-flight procedures. The first step was refueling, taking on a bit of extra fuel to ensure there was enough for navigating through bad weather if needed. Afterward, the plane was pushed back from the gate and aligned with the runway using taxiing procedures. Shortly after, the flight received clearance for takeoff. The aircraft began speeding down the runway, and the journey to Paris commenced. As Air France 447 gradually increased its speed and left Rio de Janeiro behind, the flight officially departed for Paris at 7:30 p.m. Shortly after takeoff, the plane reached its designated cruising altitude, and the pilots relaxed. Passengers, too, began preparing for sleep since it was nighttime. Once the plane reached an altitude of 20,000 feet, the relief pilot went to the rest cabin located behind the cockpit for a scheduled 3-hour break. The aircraft gradually climbed to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. After passing through Brasilia's air traffic control, the flight entered the Recife air traffic control zone. Recife was the last air traffic control point the plane communicated with, as after that, Air France 447 entered the Atlantic Ocean and left the radar coverage area. However, even though the plane exited radar coverage, air traffic control could still receive information related to the flight. This was possible because the plane's location over the ocean was monitored via satellite systems, ensuring tracking even when outside traditional radar range. At this point, the plane was cruising smoothly at its assigned altitude as it entered the Atlantic Ocean. The two pilots discussed the potential danger of upcoming weather, but neither of them talked about how they would handle it. The aircraft was approaching the Intertropical Convergence Zone, ITC. Based on the data, the captain knew that the plane would soon enter stormy clouds. However, this didn't concern him much, as it was not an unfamiliar situation. A little later, the captain pressed a button to call the relief pilot from the rest cabin. After handing over his seat to the relief pilot, the captain went to rest. The relief pilot, with no prior warning about the impending danger, took control, but the captain, despite being the most experienced, did not inform him how to deal with the storm clouds. At 2:08 a.m. UTC, while most of the passengers were peacefully sleeping, they started hearing strange noises, as if something was continuously hitting the plane. Within seconds, the sound grew louder due to ice striking the aircraft. At this point, the plane was still flying well in the right direction without any issues. However, at 2:10 a.m., things began to go wrong when the plane's auto-throttle system and autopilot suddenly disengaged on their own. This triggered a warning alarm in the cockpit, causing the pilots to panic, unsure of why the autopilot had suddenly turned off. The cause of this malfunction was ice crystals accumulating in the plane's pitot tubes, which are responsible for measuring airspeed. When ice crystals clog these tubes, they can no longer provide accurate airspeed data to the autopilot system, resulting in its disengagement. Although these tubes are equipped with heating mechanisms to melt ice, in cases where large ice crystals block the tubes, the heating fails, leading to inaccurate airspeed readings. This caused several malfunctions in the aircraft, and multiple safety functions began to fail one after another. As the angle of attack, bank angle, and overspeed protection systems disengage, Air France 447 becomes extremely sensitive, significantly increasing the risk to the aircraft. While both pilots in the cockpit are still trying to understand the situation, a strong gust of wind causes the plane to veer to the left. Suddenly, multiple warning alarms go off inside the cockpit, and the plane begins to descend. The first officer quickly takes control of the aircraft, using the side stick to try to stabilize it. However, instead of stabilizing, the situation becomes even more unstable. Caution is always important, whether it's air travel or the safety of your home. The first officer, feeling slightly panicked, tries to stabilize the plane and bring it back to the correct altitude. However, the situation worsens. Due to ice forming in the pitot tubes, not only does the autopilot disengage, but the air data computer, which provides critical information such as airspeed, altitude, and air temperature, starts displaying incorrect data. The first officer continues to attempt to regain the aircraft's preferred altitude, but at that moment, the stall warning begins to sound. Understanding the concept of a stall is crucial, as it plays a significant role in this incident. A stall occurs when the wing's angle relative to the direction of the airflow, angle of attack, becomes too steep, preventing air from flowing smoothly over the wing. As a result, the wing is unable to generate lift, causing the aircraft to begin falling. Despite the first officer's efforts to manage the situation, things continue to deteriorate, with warning alarms sounding more frequently in the cockpit. On the EICAS screen, 10 different types of alerts began to appear, meant to notify the crew of the ongoing issues. However, in his panic, the first officer was unable to pay attention to these alerts. After reviewing the information, the relief pilot informed him that the auto-throttle system had disengaged and needed to be manually controlled. as indicated by a displayed message. Instead of taking manual control, the first officer disconnected it, causing the plane to pitch upward even more sharply. This further complicated the situation, presenting a significant challenge for the first officer to handle. Meanwhile, the caution lights in the cockpit began to illuminate, indicating that if the plane wasn't stabilized soon, they would lose control entirely. After much effort, the pilots managed to recover from the stall problem, allowing them a brief moment of relief. However, just seconds later, the stall warning sounded again. The situation remained dire for several reasons. First, the weather outside was extremely turbulent. Second, the aircraft's internal systems were providing incorrect readings, making it dangerous to trust the data. To make matters worse, it was nighttime, and the pilots could not visually assess the weather conditions outside to gauge their surroundings. When the stall warning reappeared, both pilots panicked. They began to realize that the plane was slipping out of their control. Inside the cockpit, turbulence was becoming increasingly severe, and despite their best efforts, they were unable to stabilize the aircraft. In a state of urgency, the relief pilot quickly pressed the call button to summon the captain to the cockpit. Meanwhile, the first officer raised the plane's nose to a 16-degree angle to prevent it from descending, which is the same angle used during takeoff. However, this action did not stabilize the situation. The first officer then attempted to control the plane using the side stick, but that too proved ineffective. Although both pilots had undergone training to handle such stalls, they had never faced a real-life scenario like this. As they struggled to regain control, they anxiously awaited the captain's arrival. Multiple warnings continued to sound in the cockpit, but the pilots were so panicked that they were unable to focus on them or take the appropriate corrective steps. After reaching an altitude of 38,000 feet, the plane began to rapidly descend toward the ocean. Inside the cabin, intense turbulence started, and the passengers began to realize they were in a critical situation. At 2:10:32 a.m., the first officer declared that the plane was completely out of their control. Just a few seconds later, the plane's nose pitched up to an 11-degree angle, and the aircraft began to descend rapidly at a dangerous speed. Once again, the stall warning sounded in the cockpit. In response, the first officer quickly pulled the nose up, temporarily silencing the warning. However, the aircraft was now plummeting toward the ocean at a descent rate between 10,000 and 15,000 feet per minute. At 2:11:10 a.m., the first officer once again pulled back on the side stick in an attempt to climb. But this caused the plane to move erratically, veering left and right. At this moment, the captain entered the cockpit, shocked at the chaotic scene unfolding before him. The relief pilot, in a state of panic, asked the captain what they should do to regain control of the plane. However, the captain, unaware of what had transpired before his arrival, replied, "I don't know what's happening, but the plane is descending rapidly." At this point, none of the three pilots had accurate information about the plane's altitude. They continued trying to regain control, with the captain instructing the first officer to use the left rudder to stop the plane from banking. All three pilots were in a highly panicked state, while the passengers, realizing the severity of the situation, began praying and looking towards the cockpit, desperate for answers. Some passengers turned to the cabin crew, trying to understand what was happening. In just a few seconds, the plane descended to 10,000 feet, making it increasingly difficult to control. The relief pilot quickly took command from the first officer and tried to stabilize the aircraft. However, at the same time, the first officer was also manipulating the side stick, leading to a dual input alarm in the cockpit. This alarm indicated that both pilots were providing input simultaneously, which canceled out any corrective action on the plane's controls. In the midst of this chaos, the first officer, overwhelmed with fear, screamed, "We are falling rapidly!" The aircraft continued its uncontrolled descent, and with both pilots inputting commands at once, their efforts had no effect on stopping the plane's downward spiral. As the situation spiraled out of control, the relief pilot began shouting, "Climb! Climb!" in a desperate attempt to lift the plane, but it was already too late. The aircraft was completely out of control. In a final attempt to regain control, the relief pilot suggested resetting the flight control computer. This process is typically used in extreme situations to reboot the system and fix any glitches. However, the captain responded that resetting the computer wouldn't make a difference. Hearing this, the relief pilot panicked even more and continued shouting, "Climb! Climb!" The first officer in response said he had already pulled the plane's nose up, but it had no effect. As the plane descended to 4,000 feet, the pilot's panic intensified. The relief pilot repeatedly attempted to input commands, but the first officer did not relinquish control, leading to the dual input alarm sounding over and over in the cockpit. The relief pilot eventually told the first officer, "Give me control," to which the first officer responded, "Go ahead, I've given you control." However, by this point, the situation had deteriorated so much that nothing seemed to work. Every time they tried to fix one issue, another problem would emerge. As they addressed one malfunction, a new one would arise, leaving them overwhelmed and unable to regain control of the aircraft. As the pilots continued to struggle, the plane descended to 2,500 feet. In desperation, the first officer pulled the side stick sharply back in an attempt to lift the aircraft, but in panic, he shouted, "We are crashing! What is happening?" In response, the captain instructed to raise the plane's nose by 10 degrees. The relief pilot tried to follow this command, but since the first officer had pressed the takeover button, the relief pilot's inputs had no effect on the aircraft. The plane continued its steep descent at a 45-degree angle, hurtling towards the ocean at a speed of 10,000 feet per minute. The aircraft got so close to the surface that recovery was no longer possible. At 2:14:28 a.m., Air France Flight 447 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, breaking into thousands of pieces. Tragically, all 228 passengers and crew members on board lost their lives instantly. After the crash, 4 different air traffic control centers that were monitoring the plane lost contact with it. They began reaching out to each other, trying to gather information about the aircraft's whereabouts, but to no avail. The high-frequency radio in that area wasn't working properly, which hindered their efforts to re-establish contact with the plane. Despite numerous attempts, they couldn't communicate with the aircraft. Other planes flying on the same route also tried to contact Air France 447, but they too were unsuccessful. Satellite communication was also attempted, but nothing worked. Finally, 2 days later, parts of the plane were spotted floating on the water, prompting search operations in that area. A day after that, the bodies of victims and more debris were recovered from the ocean. However, the black box, crucial for understanding why the accident occurred, was not found. Despite extensive search efforts for a long time, the black box remained missing. This led to an even larger scale search operation, where a significant portion of the ocean was scanned to locate the black box and uncover the cause of the crash. Finally, after 2 years of intense efforts, on April 2nd, 2011, the black box was recovered from a depth of 12,000 feet. Once retrieved, the full story of the incident came to light, as I have just explained. According to the report, the primary cause of the crash was the blockage of the pitot tubes, which led to multiple systems failing to function properly. In response, the design of the pitot tubes was later modified to ensure that they wouldn't become completely blocked even in extreme weather conditions. Additionally, pilots were given special training to handle such situations in the future to prevent similar accidents. While the malfunctioning of the pitot tubes was officially identified as the primary reason for the crash, some people believe that the pilots initially took the situation too lightly, which prevented them from taking timely action and ultimately contributed to the disaster. What do you think? Was this accident mainly caused by extreme weather and the ice blocking the pitot tubes, or was it due to pilot error? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That's all for today. See you in the next video. Until then, goodbye.